The Christmas murder of JonBenet Ramsey. 30 years. No answers. A 6-year-old girl is found dead in her own basement, less than 12 hours after her mother said goodnight to her. The note demanding ransom was written inside the house, on the family's own notepad, with the family's own pen. The amount demanded, $118,000, was almost the exact figure of the father's Christmas bonus that year, a number no outsider should have known. And the man who found the body wasn't a police officer. It was her father, alone, in a room investigators had already searched, and somehow missed. 30 years later, no one has ever been charged. No one has ever stood trial. And as of this year, investigators in Boulder, Colorado are quietly rerunning DNA through machines that didn't exist when this case went cold. This is the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why a 6-year-old's death became one of the most contested, most mishandled, and most chilling unsolved cases in American history. Stick with me until the end, because the most damning piece of evidence in this entire case doesn't show up until decades after the murder, and it raises more questions than it answers. I'm your host, and this is Dark Minds. To understand why this case exploded the way it did, you have to understand the family at the center of it. JonBenet Ramsey was, by every outward measure, a success story. He ran Access Graphics, a Lockheed Martin computer distribution subsidiary, and in 1996 the company pulled in roughly $1 billion in revenue. He lived in a 15-room Tudor-style home on 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado, a university town known more for its mountain views and granola politics than for headline-grabbing crime. His wife, Patsy Ramsey, had been Miss West Virginia in 1977 and a finalist at Miss America. She channeled that same pageant world into her daughter. JonBenet, a name blended from her father's first and middle names, JonBenet, had been competing in children's beauty pageants since she was 4 years old. Crowns, sequins, spray tans on a 6-year-old. Titles like Little Miss Colorado and America's Royale Mississippi. The family also included Burke, JonBenet's older brother, 9 years old at the time, and 2 adult children from John's first marriage. On paper, it was the kind of household true crime almost never touches: gated community wealth, private school, a Christmas tree still glowing in the living room. December 25, 1996 was, by every account, a normal Christmas. The Ramseys opened presents that morning. That evening, they went to a holiday party at the home of their friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. JonBenet reportedly fell asleep in the car on the ride home. John carried her upstairs to bed. Patsy says she tucked her in around 10 p.m. in the clothes she'd worn that day because she didn't want to wake her. It was the last time either parent says they saw JonBenet alive. Here's where it gets strange almost immediately, because what happened in the next 8 hours doesn't just describe a murder. It describes one of the most contaminated, chaotic crime scenes in modern American criminal history. And a lot of that chaos was self-inflicted by the people who were supposed to be protecting the evidence. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey called 911. Her voice on that call has been picked apart by audio analysts for 3 decades. Panicked, breathless, telling the dispatcher that her daughter was missing and that there was a ransom note. Officers arrived within minutes. What they found sitting on the spiral staircase was a 2.5-page handwritten letter, one of the longest ransom notes in the history of American kidnapping cases. Most ransom notes are short, functional. This one read almost like a movie script, full of phrases like claiming to represent a small foreign faction and warning the family not to involve police. But here's the detail that should have ended the stranger abduction theory before lunchtime. The note was written on a notepad that belonged to the Ramseys, found inside their own home. The pen used to write it was also from inside the house. Whoever wrote that note didn't bring their own supplies. They used what was already there, which meant either they'd been inside long enough to find a notepad and pen in an unfamiliar house in the dark, or they never needed to find anything at all because they already knew where it was. And then there's the number, $118,000. Investigators would later learn that John Ramsey had received a bonus from his company that year for almost exactly that amount. Not a round number like 100,000 or 150,000. A specific figure that an outside kidnapper, breaking into a stranger's house in the middle of the night, should have had no way of knowing. Handwriting experts were brought in almost immediately to compare the note to samples from Patsy Ramsey. The results were maddeningly inconclusive. Some analysts said certain letter formations were consistent with her writing. Others said key characteristics ruled her out entirely. To this day, no handwriting expert has been able to definitively attribute that note to anyone. Now, under normal protocol, the moment police treat a child as a kidnapping victim with a ransom note in hand, the house becomes a sealed crime scene. That is not what happened here. Friends of the family, including their pastor, were allowed into the home throughout the morning. People made coffee. People walked through rooms. People touched things. At one point, officers were so focused on the idea that this was an active kidnapping in progress, waiting for a phone call from the supposed kidnappers, that almost no one was treating the house itself as a place where evidence needed to be preserved. And then, just before 1 in the afternoon, a detective made a request that would change the entire trajectory of this case. Detective Linda Arndt asked John Ramsey and a family friend, Fleet White, to walk through the house and check if anything seemed out of place, to look for anything unusual the police might have missed. John Ramsey went down to the basement, specifically to a small windowless storage room off to the side, what the family called the wine cellar. And that's where he found her. JonBenet's body was on the floor, partially covered by a white blanket. Her wrists were bound above her head with a length of cord. There was duct tape across her mouth. And around her neck was a garrote, a cord looped and tightened using a broken paintbrush handle as a twisting device, the kind of paintbrush that matched a set belonging to Patsy Ramsey's own painting supplies. John picked his daughter up, carried her upstairs, and laid her on the living room floor. Investigators would later point to this moment as one of the most damaging in the entire case. Not because of what it suggested about guilt, but because of what it destroyed. Moving a body in a homicide investigation contaminates trace evidence, disturbs positioning that forensic analysts rely on, and, as some investigators have argued, may have happened in a room that police had already supposedly cleared during an earlier walkthrough that morning. That's the detail that still unsettles people the most. Officers had reportedly already done a cursory search of the house that morning, including the basement, and somehow missed a body in a room with a broken window latch and the door propped slightly open. The autopsy, conducted the following day by the Boulder County coroner, found that JonBenet died from a combination of strangulation and a severe skull fracture. Blunt force trauma to the head significant enough that some pathologists believed it alone would have been fatal within minutes. The exact sequence, whether she was struck first and then strangled or strangled and then struck, has been debated by forensic experts for 30 years. The autopsy also documented genital trauma, which fueled immediate and intense public speculation about sexual assault. The forensic interpretation of those findings has been a point of significant, ongoing dispute among pathologists. Some have argued the injuries indicated an isolated assault at the time of death. Others have pointed to additional findings they believed suggested a pattern of past trauma, a conclusion other examiners involved in the case have directly contested. It remains one of the most argued-over pieces of physical evidence in the entire file. A 6-year-old girl, dead in her own home, on the day after Christmas. And from that point forward, this stopped being a missing child case. It became a murder investigation with an impossibly small suspect pool, because every entry point into that house appeared to be locked from the inside, except for one small basement window with a broken latch that may or may not have been disturbed before the murder at all. Here's the uncomfortable math investigators were left with. There was no sign of forced entry that investigators considered conclusive. Boulder had received a light dusting of snow that night, and no footprints were found leading away from the house. The family's 2 dogs, usually noted for barking at any disturbance, reportedly didn't wake anyone. And inside the home, intruder evidence was thin to non-existent, while family members had been present the entire night. That combination, no forced entry, no footprints, an inside-sourced ransom note, an unusually specific dollar figure, is exactly why suspicion turned, almost immediately and almost entirely, toward the people who lived in that house. Patsy Ramsey became, in the eyes of much of the public and a significant portion of investigators, suspect number 1. The handwriting question never fully went away. Critics pointed to the strange tone of the ransom note. Overwritten, almost performative. and floated theories that it had been staged after the fact to redirect attention from something that happened earlier that night, possibly an accident. Patsy maintained her innocence until her death from ovarian cancer in 2006, never charged with anything. John Ramsey faced his own scrutiny, as the person who found the body, moved it, and whose business bonus matched the ransom figure almost to the dollar. He too was never charged. And then there was Burke, 9 years old at the time. Investigators in the earliest days of the case reportedly looked closely at whether a sibling altercation could have escalated, possibly involving a blow from a household object, followed by a panicked cover-up by the adults in the house. Burke has never been charged with any crime, has consistently denied any involvement, and was formally excluded as a contributor to the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenet's clothing. I want to be very clear here, because this case has a long history of trial by internet. None of these family members have ever been charged with JonBenet's murder. Suspicion is not evidence, and for 30 years, prosecutors have said the evidence to charge anyone simply hasn't been there. But that didn't stop one of the strangest twists in the entire case. A secret decision made behind closed doors that the public wouldn't learn about for over a decade. In 1999, a Boulder County grand jury spent over a year reviewing the evidence in JonBenet's murder. And according to records that stayed sealed for 14 years, that grand jury actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey. Not for the murder itself, but for child abuse resulting in death, a charge tied to the idea that they had endangered their daughter and then helped cover up what happened to her. Then District Attorney Alex Hunter looked at that recommendation and declined to sign it. He told the public only that there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute successfully. He didn't reveal that a grand jury had already voted to indict. That detail stayed buried until 2013, when a Colorado judge ordered the indictment documents unsealed after a lawsuit from local media. Think about what that means. For 14 years, the public believed prosecutors simply never had enough to bring charges. In reality, a jury of Boulder citizens looked at the same evidence law enforcement had and concluded charges were warranted. And one elected official overruled them, behind closed doors, with no public explanation at the time. That single decision is, to this day, one of the most contested choices in the entire case. Did Hunter make the right call, recognizing that an indictment without enough evidence to convict would have destroyed a family without delivering justice? Or did political and reputational pressure in a wealthy university town keep this case from ever reaching a courtroom? We may never get a definitive answer, but it set the tone for the next 2.5 decades. A case with enormous public suspicion, almost no public accountability, and a family that lived the rest of their lives under a cloud they were never formally charged with in a court of law. And just when the public thought this case couldn't get any stranger, in 2006, a man on the other side of the world stepped forward and confessed to the murder. In August 2006, a former schoolteacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand. He had been corresponding with a journalism professor who was researching the case, and in those communications, he claimed he had been with JonBenet the night she died. He told investigators her death was an accident that occurred during what he described, chillingly, as an act of affection that went wrong. For a few days, it looked like the case had finally cracked open after a decade. Carr was extradited back to Boulder. Cameras followed his every move off the plane. Headlines ran his confession as if it were confirmed fact. Then the DNA came back. Carr's genetic profile did not match the unidentified male DNA recovered from the crime scene. Investigators also found significant holes in his account, details about the crime scene that didn't line up, and evidence that he may not have even been in Colorado at the time of the murder. Within days, all charges were dropped. It turned out Carr had a documented history of fixating on the case and on child victims more broadly, and investigators ultimately concluded his confession was false. A disturbing but not unprecedented phenomenon in high-profile cases, where individuals with their own psychological motivations insert themselves into crimes they had no part in. The Carr episode set the investigation back in the public eye, turning a tragedy into a media circus, and reinforcing for a lot of armchair detectives that nothing about this case would ever be simple. But buried inside that disaster was the one piece of physical evidence that would eventually do what 30 years of theories couldn't. It would clear an entire family. The unidentified male DNA recovered from JonBenet's clothing, first found in the original 1997 testing and present in at least 3 separate locations, had never matched anyone in the Ramsey family. For years, the existence of that DNA was treated as a secondary detail, overshadowed by suspicion toward the parents. In 2008, advances in touch DNA technology allowed investigators to test it more thoroughly than the original 1990s-era methods allowed. The results confirmed what that DNA had suggested all along. An unidentified male's genetic material not matching John, not matching Patsy, not matching Burke, not matching any of the Ramseys. Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey did something almost unheard of in American criminal justice. She issued a formal, public letter to John Ramsey, apologizing on behalf of her office for any role they had played in the public perception that the family was responsible for JonBenet's death. The Ramseys, at least in the eyes of that DA's office, were officially exonerated. It should have closed the book. For a lot of the public, it didn't. Some investigators and forensic experts who worked the case have continued to argue publicly that touch DNA can transfer in ways unrelated to the crime itself, through manufacturing, through packaging, through secondhand contact, and that its presence doesn't definitively rule out other scenarios. The debate over what that DNA actually proves has never fully settled, even among people who worked the case professionally. What it did do was shift the legal landscape entirely. No Ramsey family member has been treated as an active suspect by Boulder police since. And the case, having burned through a false confession and a secret indictment and a formal exoneration, went cold in the way most unsolved murders eventually do, not forgotten, but no longer actively pursued with any urgency, until television got involved again and reopened a wound that had barely begun to close. In 2016, CBS aired a multi-part docuseries re-examining the case for its 20th anniversary. A panel of investigators and forensic consultants featured in the series suggested a theory that Burke, then 9 years old, might have struck his sister with a blunt object, possibly a flashlight, in what they framed as a sibling conflict gone catastrophically wrong, and that the ransom note and staging were a desperate parental cover-up afterward. Burke Ramsey, by then an adult living a private life, was not part of that production and has consistently and forcefully denied any involvement in his sister's death. He sued CBS along with several of the experts featured in the special for defamation. The legal fallout was significant. In a related case against one of the forensic pathologists involved, a Michigan jury awarded Burke Ramsey a $750 million judgment in 2016, though whether that amount was ever actually collected is a separate and much murkier story. His broader lawsuit against CBS itself was allowed to proceed by a judge who found the claims had legal merit, and the case was ultimately settled out of court in 2019 under undisclosed terms. It was a stark reminder of something that runs through this entire case. 30 years after JonBenet's death, the people connected to this family are still fighting legal battles over what the public is allowed to believe about them, in the complete absence of any criminal conviction. As we approach the 30th anniversary of JonBenet's murder this December, this case is, somehow, more active than it's been in years. In late 2025, Boulder's police chief publicly confirmed that investigators had conducted new interviews, re-interviewed people connected to the case based on fresh tips, and submitted previously untested physical evidence to advanced forensic laboratories using DNA sequencing technology that simply didn't exist in the 1990s. Some of that testing is reportedly targeting items never fully analyzed the first time around, and partial genetic profiles have already been isolated from at least 2 pieces of evidence. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, has continued to publicly push for exactly this kind of renewed testing, and has said he's been briefed that results are expected sometime around the anniversary itself. Burke has reportedly told investigators he's willing to provide any further DNA needed for elimination purposes, just as he did in 2008. Whether any of this leads to an arrest remains to be seen. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that's cracked decades-old cold cases across the country in recent years by matching crime scene DNA to distant relatives in public genealogy databases, is exactly the kind of tool that didn't exist when this case first went cold, and exactly the kind of tool that has solved cases everyone assumed would stay unsolved forever. For 3 decades, this case has been a symbol of everything that can go wrong in a high-profile investigation. A contaminated crime scene, a secret grand jury vote, a false confession that hijacked headlines, and a family torn apart by suspicion they were never formally charged with in court. Whether modern forensic science finally closes that file, or whether JonBenet Ramsey's killer goes to the grave never identified, may be answered within the next few months. JonBenet Ramsey would be in her mid-30s right now if she'd been given the chance. Instead, her case became a permanent fixture of American true crime, not because the mystery was satisfying, but because almost nothing about how it was handled was satisfying. A crime scene that was never properly secured, a note that pointed inward, a confession that turned out to be a lie, and a family that has spent 30 years insisting their innocence in the court of public opinion because they were never given the chance to prove it in an actual courtroom. If you want to see where this case goes next, because there is a very real chance we get an answer before the year is out, make sure you're subscribed because I'll be covering any update the moment it breaks. What's your theory? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.